Elizabeth, also known as Libby, welcome to our show.
Hey, it's great to be here.
And we had a great pre-conversation around
Yeah.
some fascinations that we share. You're more grounded
hmm
in the rigorous academic sort of scholarship-based history and all of the mystery that prevails or in the community around Mary Magdalene in that regard.
Yeah, that's how she grabbed my life. She grabs everybody differently, though.
Yeah, we were talking about that too. I think you said she hijacked your life. I was
She
like,
totally
oh.
hijacked my life in a way that I would never have
Oh my
expected.
gosh, I completely relate to that. That's what happened over here.
Yes.
So let's start with your background. I think it's really
Sure.
fascinating. You started with music and then
Mhm.
from music into Mary Magdalene into now this biblical scholarship path.
Yeah, so I went to college and I was a music major and then I was in a band and we won this contest and we toured and it's funny because sometimes the themes of my life in music were also centered around divine feminine. Like I won this Pantene contest right after I graduated college and literally the slogan was celebrating what women have to say.
Mm.
And I won the contest with a song called Blood Red Moon that was about a late period. And so that I was like touring with Jewel and Poe.
Really?
Yeah, like and then I was on an episode of the Gilmore Girls. So these are all very like,
You were on the Guild.
female.
What? That was like my
Yes.
favorite show.
Yeah, no, I'm one of the troubadours in that episode where Luke and Lorelai are fighting. The season 6 finale. Um, so I mean, there's a regular theme of sort of feminine voices. I mean, I think of the Gilmore Girls very much that way, and
Totally.
certainly Jewel and like this Pantene slogan. It was sort of along the way I realized there was something to do with like the feminine voice. And I was so committed to my music career. And I was so sure that that's who I was. I did it for like 12 years. I was a singer songwriter. You can go and find a million of my, well, I don't know, like 50 of my songs on Amazon or Apple Music or whatever. And then, kind of out of the blue, while I was living in New York City, I wrote a song about Mary Magdalene,
Okay,
which,
but why
you know,
did
my
I'm just curious, why were you drawn in? What do you think that's about? Why Mary Magdalene song?
big mystery. I mean, I was at that time like not really sure what was going to happen next in my music career, and I had had this interesting meeting with my lawyer, my music lawyer, and funnily enough, Jules' mother,
Mm.
and we were like talking about what to do with my career, and Jewel and her mom do not get along, and there's interesting things about Nedra that we don't need to go into, but she does have a lot of I would say she's talented and insightful in certain ways. And I remember in this meeting, Nedra said to me, "You just need to jump off the cliff." And like we had this candle lit, and we were in my lawyer's office in New York City, and it was like this whole sort of music business powwow. And then suddenly I was, I was like, okay, I need to go pray about this. And there was this garden dedicated to the Virgin Mary around the corner from where I was living at that time in Brooklyn. And I was praying because I had recently sort of felt that the Virgin Mary was sort of my spiritual guide, and I had recently begun praying the Rosary. And I heard words in response, which was a total surprise because usually I don't hear words when I pray. I just usually am praying or I get feelings in response. And the words were, maybe you should talk to Mary Magdalene about that.
Mm.
And I was like, what? Like, that's I was talking to the Virgin Mary. I mean, I have pictures of the garden that where I was praying. It was dedicated to the Virgin Mary. I had all these statues. I immediately like emailed Jules' mother to like tell her about it. I immediately like wrote a song within like 2 days about Mary Magdalene, which
What is the name of it?
Magdalene.
I'm gonna
And
go
like
look. I'm gonna go put it into the intro. Like, I think it should. That's
there's a
awesome.
music video. I mean, I did all this stuff thinking, okay, this is about my path in the music business. And so I wrote this song about Mary Magdalene. And then I was just like, oh, I can't write a song and name my record about Mary Magdalene without researching her. So I like walked over to the Brooklyn Public Library. I got my like the Complete Idiot's Guide to Mary Magdalene and just started like reading on her. And then I know you've done this as well. I'm like, oh, I should go to the south of France and like check out these mysteries. Like, wow, this
Mhm.
is cool. And so I found a way to get to the south of France and I was exploring, and then it just kind of kept going. And somewhere along the way, I had this thought, which to me seemed really straightforward, which was, okay, so Mary Magdalene was controversial. That's what I learned from the Complete Idiot's Guide.
I didn't know there was a
And
complete idiot's guide. I wish I
oh,
would
it's
have had that.
great. It's super. It's an excellent introduction to Mary Magdalene. And and I was like, okay, so there's controversy around her, and the Gospel of John is the one that features her the most. This scene between Jesus and Mary Magdalene in the garden. And so I'm like, I want to look at the world's oldest copy of the Gospel of John and just see if there's anything funny about
Mhm.
around Mary Magdalene. Does it say something different? Was something crossed out? I was just like, maybe the scholars missed something. Like, I want to look at it, which is a totally ridiculous thing for someone who has no training to think, honestly. Like, I'm some singer songwriter living in Brooklyn, and I'm like, oh, maybe I'll find something the scholars missed. Except that's kind of what happened. I did end up finding out that the world's oldest copy of John, or the oldest substantial copy, is called Papyrus 66. It's dated to about 200 AD.
Mm.
And it's a nearly complete copy of the Gospel of John that was discovered in the 1950s. And so I was like, okay, I want to look at that. And I had to sort of ask around and get some scholars. Like a friend of my hometown parish priest recommended me to a scholar in Manhattan who I sat down with. Her name is Deirdre Good. And she was able to send me a link to a transcription of Papyrus 66, which was unfortunately in Greek. I'm
Mhm.
like, I don't know how to I thought somebody would have translated it, but no, this is 2012. And
Wow.
I was very determined, and I used an interlinear study Bible where I could look at every single word of the papyrus, like transcribed, next to every single word of the Gospel of John, and then like what each word means. And that was maybe a first clue that I was maybe going to be an academic, that I would go
Mm.
to
But
that
you were
length.
onto something.
Well, the thing is, I didn't know if I was on to something.
But you were following your soul. You were following this, like we call it the red thread. You're probably familiar with that term. It's just pulling
My
you,
most
right?
recent record is called Red Thread.
No way.
I'm gonna have to send you a copy of my record
Oh,
called
please.
Red
Oh my gosh, this is all new
Thread.
to me. Please. Yes.
That's so funny. That's so funny that you would say that. Yes, it is. It was the red thread. And so I just was looking at it, and I looked, in chapter 20 where Mary is talking to Jesus in the garden, and it looks like it's supposed to look. And I looked in chapter 19 where Mary Magdalene's at the cross, and that looked like it was supposed to look. And just the one thing I hadn't yet done, that I thought that I should do, was to look at John chapter 11. That's the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead, because I found out from the Complete Idiot's Guide that some people have always wondered whether Mary of Bethany was the same woman as Mary Magdalene. That's
Right.
the woman who anoints Jesus in John's gospel.
Right.
And
And I'm sure
so
you're familiar with Margaret Starbird. Did that find you at that time? The woman with
it
the
did
apple?
eventually, yeah, I did eventually make contact with Margaret, but not at this time.
Got it.
I was just looking at this copy of the Gospel of John, and so I go to literally the world's oldest copy of the Gospel of John, and I'm going to look at John 11. And if you look at this website, you can see in the transcription and in the photographs of the papyrus that the name Mary has just been crossed out a few times. And
Not
I was
good.
just like, what?
What?
And so the first time the name Mary is crossed out, well, it's one letter that's changed. The name Maria is changed to Martha. Maria is
Mm.
Mary in Greek, and Martha, it's just one letter's difference because it's a theta in Greek, which is a th. And then that's in John 11, verse 1. And then in John 11, verse 3, her name is just super scratched out. It's like Maria, and it's awkwardly scratched out. And just from my interlinear study Bible, I was able to see that it's changed to say Hi Adelphi, the sisters, and that all the verbs had been changed from singular to plural. So it looked like Martha was getting added in to the story. And I'm like, what? I'm like, wait, hold on. This is the story of, like, Lazarus and Martha and Mary, those siblings. And, everybody knows Martha and Mary. Those are those sisters. And Mary's sitting
Right.
at Jesus's feet. But that's in a different gospel. That's in Luke's gospel. And I was like,
Yeah,
wait a
and it's
second.
like they draw a lot of polarity in religious settings between
Mhm.
Mary sitting at the feet, Martha doing all the work in the kitchen.
That's
It's like,
true.
be more like Mary, not Martha. She was too
The Marys and the Marthas. Yeah, that has a long interpretation history in Christianity. But what's interesting is that in Luke's gospel, they don't have a brother.
Uh-huh.
And also in Luke's gospel, the story takes place in the north, sort of in Galilee or maybe Samaria. Whereas in John's gospel, it says that Lazarus, Mary, and Martha live in Bethany, which is just outside Jerusalem. So I mean, I grew up going to church. I went to the Episcopal Church growing up, and I was just saying, wait a second, hold on. Just from this oldest papyrus of the Gospel of John, it looks like they're sticking in the character Martha into the
Mm.
story. And we know where Martha comes from. She comes from Luke's gospel. Totally different gospel, totally different story. I'm like, wait, hold on. Wait, is Martha and Mary in Luke's gospel different than Lazarus and Mary in John's gospel? I was like, I mean, this never would have occurred to me if I hadn't seen with my own eyes that this scribe is literally changing the story, adding
Mm.
Martha in over the course of a few verses. And then at a certain point in Papyrus 66, Martha is there, but it seems as anyway, the point is, I ended up just saying, okay, wait a second. It looks like at the beginning of the story, Martha is getting added in. So I copied it and I sent it to this scholar at the seminary in Manhattan, Deirdre Good. And I said, look at this. Martha's getting added in this world's oldest copy. And she said, oh, very interesting. And she didn't know anything about it. And I was like, wait, hold on. These are world-class Bible scholars. Aren't they talking about this?
Mhm.
And the answer was no. Nobody had really done any work on it. I was like, come on, what have people said about this change? I was able to go back to the Brooklyn Library and get on interlibrary loan and get academic articles. Again, a clue that I was going to become an academic. I was like asking for on interlibrary loan from my local public library for really sort of hardcore academic journals of
That's
what
so
people had
epic that you
said.
did that. Can I just honor that? Like, who
Aw.
does that? That doesn't have, like, that's how you know it's totally like soul driven and part of your path, because
Mm.
most people wouldn't have that fascination to go to those lengths.
Thank you. Thank you. And I also want to credit the Episcopal Church with the way that I grew up, because there was never a time in my life where I was told there was something I could not do.
You're so lucky. You're so lucky.
Well, I'm grateful. I mean, they just had a movie come out about the Philadelphia 11, which are the women who are willing to get ordained in the Episcopal Church in the
Yeah, I was gonna say
1960s.
that's what I equate Episcopalianism or whatever is with ordaining women ministers. Clergy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I grew up in a world where that was normal. And that was, so it was never, if I felt a call to the priesthood, I could have followed it. I didn't. I mean, I felt called to spirituality, but then I was like, no, I want to be a musician. I don't want to be a priest. I want to be a musician. But I think that there's something about the Episcopal Church or there's something about the formation, not just of women, but of humans, that if you don't traumatize them and you don't like limit them, that they'll just grow. And so I feel
Yeah.
like it wasn't such, I mean, it was just, I was just like, wait, hasn't anybody done anything about this? The name Mary's been
Yeah,
crossed
because my
out.
first thing would have been like, "Is this okay?" Like, just from my religious upbringing.
Right.
Like, "Is this okay?"
That's interesting. And actually some women have told me that like they would feel almost scared to look at the world's oldest copy because it's not their role. And
Right.
and
Like,
so
who am
I
I to
again,
dissect a
yeah.
sacred text? That's the that's my religious leader's job, like, to see if this is actually a legit thing.
And some people might get angry at the Episcopal Church that they raise such presumptuous ladies. But that's what I did. I said, I want to go look at this. And so I just got the academic articles and I found that people had talked about it in the 1960s, soon after the papyrus was published. And one of the world's most important textual critics from the 20th century, Gordon Fee, most respected conservative textual critic, he said, oh, look, the name Mary's been crossed out a couple of times. And oh, look, a woman's been split in two in John 11, verse
Ooh.
3. That's the strangest change in this entire manuscript.
Hmm.
And that was basically the end of the
It's
scholarship.
like, moving on.
Exactly. I mean, there are a lot of changes in Papyrus 66. I should mention that too. It is the world's oldest copy of the Gospel of John, and there are 450 corrections made to it. So that's another whole other conversation.
Right.
But of those 450 corrections, Gordon Fee said this is the most interesting. And nobody followed up in it, and I don't know why. And so here it was on my plate. I'm some singer-songwriter in Brooklyn, realizing that nobody's done anything about this. And so I ended up enrolling in a master's program. And so I ended up working with Deirdre Good at General Seminary. It's an Episcopal seminary. And so I didn't study to be ordained. As I said, I don't feel the call to be a priest, but I do feel a call to be an academic. And I also felt the call to do it in a in a setting where the information would be respected. I didn't want to do it in a secular environment. I wanted
Right.
to do it in a
You needed
seminary.
that that exploratory field for, you need to be open. Nobody clipping your wings.
Well, it's also it's my sacred text also. So I didn't want to be taught about it just as history. I wanted to learn about it in a seminary environment. So anyway, so I enrolled in the master's program, and then my master's thesis was a study not just of Papyrus 66, but over 100 copies of the Gospel of John, because I had to learn ancient Greek, and then I was given resources for how to find other manuscripts and how to research. And it turns out that dozens of manuscripts of the Gospel of John have the name Mary changed to Martha. One in three of the old,
Really?
yeah, one in three of the old Latin manuscripts of John has some sort of problem around Martha, and one in five of the Greek manuscripts. And you can actually reconstruct almost the entire chapter of Lazarus being raised from the dead with just Lazarus and Mary using real manuscripts. And I was like, wait a second. Okay, hold on. Why would somebody want to stick Martha into this story? And I think I felt a real key to it had to do when I found out that this church father, Tertullian, who wrote at the
Yes, I'm
turn of the
familiar with
third
him.
century, yes, Tertullian, he wrote at the turn of the third century, and he was one of the first to comment on John's gospel. And he says, oh, when Mary confessed Jesus as the Christ. And I'm like, what? Because your Bible would say that Martha confesses Jesus as the Christ. Not only that, but if you read scholarship on the Gospel of John, you find out that this is the thesis statement of the Gospel of John that
Mm,
Martha utters. It's when Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me will never die. Do you believe this? Which probably some of your listeners know that quote. You're
right.
nodding like
Yeah.
you're probably recognizing this, but people don't always remember who he's talking to, because the person he's talking to is a minor character.
Mm.
So I was saying, wait, hold on. Wait a second. Tertullian thinks that Mary is confessing Jesus as the
The
Christ.
reason I bring up that I'm familiar with Tertullian is he was not female friendly, which I
Oh,
find
no, no, no,
very
no, no, no.
fascinating that this would come around to Mary. Yeah.
But the thing is that maybe his copy of the Gospel of John had not been changed, because he's writing at the turn of the third century, around the same time that Papyrus 66 was copied. I mean, he's one of the oldest church fathers that there are. So
Hmm.
maybe it's just in his copy, Mary confessing Jesus is the Christ, and he's just commenting on the text as he has it.
Hmm.
So I'm saying that might have been around the time that Martha might have been taken from the Gospel of Luke, someone who read the Gospel of Luke. Because,
Right.
in the second century, people started to read multiple Gospels. So if someone knows Luke's Gospel and they know the story of those two sisters, they're like, you know what? Hold on. People are thinking that this Mary of Bethany is Mary Magdalene. They were thinking that. We know that as far back as interpretation history goes. What if you're reading the Gospel of John and Mary's confessing Jesus as the Christ? And
Mm.
then she anoints Jesus right after that. And then if you think she's Mary Magdalene, she's at the cross. She's the first one to go to the tomb by herself. She gets the first appearance of the risen Jesus. And Jesus is the first to send her out into the world. This makes
So
her a
significant.
super threatening central character in the Gospel of John. So why would you add Martha to like fix that problem?
That is absolutely riveting.
So
So,
Martha, so I'm saying that maybe like Papyrus 66 and all these dozens of other copies are preserving for us this red thread in the
yes.
manuscript record that shows that maybe Martha is there in the Gospel of John as sort of a decoy to distract you away from Mary and her importance in the Gospel of John, to make you think of a different
To
gospel.
decentralize Mary, really.
Correct. To dilute her and to fracture her, to break her up into three different women. Now she's not Mary Magdalene, the confessor of Jesus as the Christ and the first witness of the risen Jesus, which, by the way, makes her sort of a threat and a rival to Peter. Okay. That's not her anymore. Now it's Mary and Martha, those great sisters that I love so
Mhm.
much from the Gospel of Luke. I love those sisters. You're distracted in thinking about those sisters instead of Mary Magdalene, how similar Lazarus's sister is to Mary Magdalene. So, of
Mm.
course, this is just scholarly theory, but I was able to submit my master's thesis to the Harvard Theological Review and it got published, which was surprising.
That's so
I'm like,
cool.
okay, whoa, my master's thesis is published in a top tier journal. And everybody was saying to me, okay, so where are you going to do your PhD? I was like, what? I'm a singer-songwriter. No, I just wanted you to know about this change in Papyrus 66. But the Magdalene had other plans. And so I ended up doing my PhD at Duke. And I just defended a few months ago, and now I'm a professor of New Testament at Villanova University,
Ooh.
which is a Catholic school, which also really surprises me. I'm like, what? Like, what
Well,
just
don't you think
happened?
those lines are like not as iron? They're gray now. Like, we're kind of all, don't you think it's more collaborative and everyone of all these different faith traditions are kind of in
Hmm.
a more of a melting pot? I don't know. I'm not in the academic world that way, but
I
it
mean,
feels
it
like,
depends upon which environment you're in. I mean, certainly in scholarship, it's more of a melting pot, though I guess I'm just surprised that a Catholic institution hired me, considering what I'm saying. I'm like, oh,
well,
maybe
you
Mary
wouldn't
Magdalene
get
was messed
hired
with.
at BYU. I'm just saying.
Well, I don't know.
Never
You'd be
know. No.
surprised. Like sometimes it's more conservative institutions that ask me to speak, like Pepperdine University and Wheaton College are quite conservative, and Southern Methodist University. They have all asked me to speak, partly because the women in these schools are speaking up, and there might
Yeah.
be some moral conflict even within the institutions. Like, oh wait, should we really not be fully honoring the gifts of women? And what
Right.
I'm saying is that maybe there was a change made to the origin of Christianity. They're like, we have to go back to our traditional origins, which said that women couldn't do these things. And I'm saying, is that what Jesus wanted? Or is that
Yeah.
what those who had power wanted?
Well,
And so
yeah.
the
That's
text itself is changing. That's what
yeah.
I'm saying.
Well, and I think maybe a lot of listeners aren't, especially familiar, with foundational Christian texts and how, I don't know, growing up, I just pictured John writing stuff down and Luke and
Mm.
Peter, and Paul, and they're all writing it down, but that's not the way we got the biblical records. They weren't even, it was oral tradition, right? It was oral
For the first few
passing down.
decades, yes.
And then so a lot of these teachings were passed down over the generations, let's just say maybe 40 years after even Christ died, right? Those
That
are
sounds
the
about right.
earliest writings that we have. And so, you know, I don't know. I won't get into that too much other than to just give some context here. When we're talking about these old records, you're saying the oldest record we have of John is 200 years after Christ's death.
Well, yeah. I mean, or let's say it's 100 years after the gospel was written.
Okay.
So because I guess I'm even with the Gospel of John, it's not necessarily about history. It's about what is the evangelist John trying to say.
Hmm.
And I'm saying that someone's interfering with the intention of John the evangelist.
Yeah.
John does purport to be rooted in eyewitness testimony.
Hmm.
So you can take John seriously or not on that. You can say John's making that up because
Yeah.
John wants people to read the gospel, or you can say, okay, maybe John is telling the truth. And there is really a disciple whom Jesus loved who gave this testimony. And then we have to like write that down. And that's a whole different conversation. But if you think that it is grounded in eyewitness testimony, I'm saying that 100 years after that eyewitness testimony was written down is the earliest copy that we have. So what
Got it.
happened in the second century?
Yeah.
I'm saying that there's it's like a black box that we can't get to or we don't know what happened. And I'm just theorizing, is it possible that in that 100 years, this character Martha was added specifically, maybe even so the Gospel of John could be accepted in the canon because it
Mm.
was too radical otherwise.
Right, 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 right. Well, okay, so there's two camps. I don't want to call them camps. I think they blend, but there's like Mary Magdalene as Jesus's beloved, and then John the beloved.
Oh, there's
Oh,
many more camps than that.
yeah,
What
I
about
know.
Thomas
I'm
the
really being
beloved? What about
reductionist
James
here.
the beloved? The
Oh, well,
thing,
see, yeah, but I'm only familiar with, my religious upbringing and how well, actually, what am I saying? It was John the beloved disciple. It wasn't Mary Magdalene in my tradition of, religious tradition. Mary Magdalene was never even mentioned, not even hardly on Easter. So do you want to explore that
mm,
just a little bit and how John became the beloved disciple? Hey, just a little break in our episode to let you know that those of you who were on the wait list for the Women's Wisdom Circle, that registration is now live. So this is a 6-month sacred circle for women wayshowers. We are going to begin our journey on spring equinox, March 19th. We will end our journey on autumnal equinox, September of this year. Go to standspeakshine.com/WWC, or you can just go to my website, CherieBurton.com, and you'll see it there on the homepage to find out more. So excited. I actually slashed the price in less than half of what I was going to charge. And so it will include 20-minute clarity call with me, as well as some fun soul declaration cards that I'll ship to you. You will also get 6 months free of my new Mind, Body, Soul membership. So once again, that's CherieBurton.com or StandSpeakShine.com/WWC. It's going to be glorious alchemy and transformation. I hope you can join us.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So the Gospel of John purports to be the testimony of an eyewitness disciple that is anonymous, but throughout it, at the very end of the gospel, there's references to the disciple whom Jesus loved throughout the Gospel of John, and at the very end in chapter 21, it says, "The disciple whom Jesus loved is the one who gave this testimony," and we know that his testimony is true. So the Gospel of John is anonymous, really. But at the end of the 2nd century, the church father Irenaeus wrote this book called Against Heresies, where he's basically railing on all of the sects of Gnosticism, Cephianism, Valentinianism, Marcionism, just all these different types of Christianity that he considered to be heresy. And it is in this work Against Heresies that he clearly states that the disciple whom Jesus loved is John. That is John of Zebedee. And ever since Irenaeus's work was very influential, that became sort of the standard position throughout the church for all of history. But maybe about a little over 100 years ago, historical critical scholarship really began to question that unquestioned church tradition. First of all, because the Gospel of John never explicitly says that it's John, it's anonymous. And second of all, because in the book of Acts, it says that John of Zebedee is illiterate. So that doesn't really work with someone who's like writing a really sophisticated, it's not just that it's dictating like memories. Whoever wrote the Gospel of John seems to have some familiarity with Platonism and with maybe Greek philosophy generally, and has training in rhetoric. And those are things that you couldn't have if you were illiterate. So that was one of the reasons that people said, oh, this can't be John of Zebedee. But there's a lot of other reasons. I mean, we could have a whole podcast episode
No,
about that.
I think it's really interesting.
But as for whether Mary is beloved, you're probably thinking of texts like the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Philip, which were also published in the 20th century. And they do explicitly say that Jesus loved Mary more than the others. But then again, there's texts like the Gospel of Thomas that say, I think that one actually says that Jesus loves James the most of everyone. And then there's also the book of Thomas the Contender that says that Thomas is the one that Jesus loves the most. So literally, the
Is
Nag
it possible he
Hammadi.
loved them all the same?
Of
You
course,
know?
of course. The question is just the identity of the eyewitness behind the Gospel of John. And some scholars have made the argument that Mary Magdalene could be that eyewitness. The trick is that she runs to the beloved disciple in John chapter 20, so they seem to be two different characters. She runs to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved. So in that instance, she is not the beloved disciple in John chapter 20. Some people could argue, oh, maybe that part was added or changed. And my response to that would be, show me the manuscript.
Right.
Because if something is changed in the record, it will leave a trace. That's the red thread that you can find if you look at the manuscripts.
Yeah. What excites me is that these manuscripts were discovered, in the 40s and 50s, right? So a lot of
Yeah.
these, and so it's like it's working, it's opened up this whole world of like Gnosticism and all these other, questions and rabbit holes to go down for researchers.
Oh, the rabbit holes are so big. People don't even know how big the rabbit holes are when they start. I certainly didn't. I'm like, oh, I'm just going to write a song about Mary Magdalene.
I know.
Yeah, right.
I know. I'm just gonna like, what are they talking about with all these like major rabbit holes for me myself. But
Oh,
what
yeah.
I want to pivot to is Mary Magdalene herself as we kind of
Mhm.
round out this um the mystery of Mary Magdalene and her
Yes.
title and how she was
Mhm.
given it. I mean, this is again another rabbit hole, but you have some really interesting takes on what her title's about, how she got it.
Yeah. So one of the first things that I had to come up against, if I'm going to say Mary Magdalene is Mary of Bethany, is that doesn't work. if you hold to the position that she is Mary of Magdala, because Magdala is a different location. Magdala is today, if you were to go to the Holy Land and go on a pilgrimage tour, they would say that this place, Magdala by the Sea of Galilee, is Mary Magdalene's hometown. And that seems to directly conflict with the possibility that she's from Bethany, even though people as far back as the 3rd century definitely thought that Mary Magdalene was from Bethany. And so what I ended up doing was I wanted to just dig into this a little bit further, because I knew that there was a total lack of consensus in antiquity as to what the word Magdalene meant. So some people thought that it was a reference to her place of origin, but some people did think it was a title. For instance, Saint Jerome wrote at the beginning of the 5th century. And the thing about Saint Jerome is he was the person who translated the entire Vulgate Bible from Hebrew and Greek into Latin. And he also lived in the Holy Land. So he's kind of someone who understands all of the languages as well as the geography and the Gospels. I mean, he
Mhm.
translated the
This
Gospels
is more like a
personally.
credible source of
Jerome is
being
one of
from
the
there.
most erudite scholars in antiquity. And he says, no, the word Magdalene, some people think it's from where she's from, but that's not what it is. It means, the word Magdalene means tower. And she was given the title Mary, the Tower S, because of her faith and her standing by Jesus, and her ministering to him. So he was saying that it was sort of it was a title given to her. Perhaps he doesn't say explicitly, but perhaps Jesus gave her this title similarly to how Simon Peter would have been given the title the Rock,
Mhm.
or James and John of Zebedee were giving the title Sons of Thunder. Jesus seemed to like to give nicknames to his disciples. So Jerome says Mary was given this title, Mary the Toweress. Um, and so that's the word Magdala just means tower. And ene is a feminine adjective descriptive ending in Greek. So it's like tower S. That's
So the
basically what
word
it means.
migdal means
Migdal
tower.
is Hebrew. Migdal is Hebrew, and Magdala is Aramaic.
Got it.
Yeah. So Aramaic is sort of like a later stage of Hebrew. So it's like a different dialect. So basically Joan Taylor, who is really more of the specialist on these things because she also does archaeology in the Holy Land, she and I decided to put our heads together because I am like, no, she really could be Mary of Bethany, and it really might be Mary of Bethany, who confesses Jesus as the Christ, is given the title Toweress.
Mhm.
And I'm saying that is a perfectly legitimate line of interpretation that was held in antiquity. And so to say she is Mary of Magdala is forcing your interpretation into the translation.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
word, it never says Maria apo Magdala. That's what it would be in Greek, Mary from Magdala. No text says that. It's Maria he Magdalene, Mary the Magdalene. And so if you say Mary of Magdala, it's saying, oh, I know what that word means, and forcing everyone who's reading your translation to agree with you. And so this is why it's really important to look at the underlying Greek. And so, yeah, Joan and I did this sort of comprehensive study of all the ancient interpretations of her name. And we basically showed there was no consensus. There's even like Jewish rabbis who confuse her with Jesus's mother. And they say that the word Magdala means hairdresser,
Yeah,
because
please.
the verb gadal in Aramaic would have mean to like pile up hair. Like it's like to
Yeah, yeah,
build something up. So it's like, is it a tower, or is it like you're building a
yeah.
hairstyle? So, but you can just see there's no consensus. It's not like everybody's like, oh yeah, Mary from Magdala. That's not what people were saying at that time. In fact, nobody said she came from Magdala by the Sea of Galilee until the 6th century. So we're just like, stop calling her Mary of Magdala. Like, that is
Mhm.
one possible meaning of the name, but it is also possible that she was given the title. And that opens up the possibility that she's from Bethany, which is what ancient people thought.
So being from Bethany with the whole Lazarus, I always say his name wrong. Lazarus, Martha, because the TH, give us some like your take on that time that they're setting the home, like, because it was obvious that Jesus had a close personal relationship with Lazarus and that family.
Mhm. So, I mean, he did seem to spend a lot of time in Bethany. Mark's gospel says that as well. Mark's was the first gospel that was written. So sometimes people think it's the closest to history. Um, And certainly there's this anointing event that takes place in Bethany. And it's really a prophetic event in Mark's gospel, because it seems the woman seems to be marking that, first of all, that he is the Messiah. And second of all, that he is going to die. He says that she's anointed him for his burial. And she seems to be in Mark and then in Matthew, which is kind of based on Mark's gospel. She seems to be the first person to truly understand that he has to die in those gospels.
Mhm.
John provides a different version of the story. She doesn't anoint him on the head, she anoints him on the feet in John's gospel, but it's still in Bethany. And she is explicitly identified as Mary. And Jesus says, and then Judas is mad at her for wasting the ointment. And Jesus says, leave her alone. She has anointed me in advance for my, she's going to keep the ointment. Let me say that again. Hold on. That's better. He says, so Judas criticizes Mary for wasting the money. And Jesus says, leave her alone. She has done it in advance for my burial. She is going to keep the ointment for the day of my burial.
Is that what the immemorial comment was?
That's in Mark's gospel. So you
Okay.
got to compare them. And this is what's most tricky. So you were talking about the mystery of the Magdalene. Um, I feel as though the historical Mary Magdalene is impossible to access,
Mm,
especially in scenes like the resurrection scene or the anointing scene, precisely because Mary seems to have been a controversial figure, possibly even back into her own lifetime. And
sure.
my sort of theory from looking at all of these texts and comparing them and looking at the manuscripts themselves is that her presence causes the story to warp, whether it be from gospel to gospel. Like, for instance, Mark says that this woman anoints Jesus, and Jesus says, what she's been told, what she's done will be told in memory of her, wherever the gospel is preached, but the name is withheld.
Mhm.
So you can find out the act that she did, but you can't find out who she is. It seems like John is trying to correct this and say her name is Mary,
Mhm.
and Jesus says, um, she will save it. She will bring it to my. She's saying, let her save it for the day of my burial, which is a slightly different spin on it. But the reason that's important is because there's only one woman named Mary at Jesus's tomb in John's gospel, and that's Mary Magdalene.
So we know
So
unequivocally that that was Mary Magdalene at the tomb. Like that's
in John's gospel. But see, again, if you compare the different evangelists' accounts, each one is different. And so I'm saying that it's almost like something about Mary causes the story to change depending upon who's telling it.
yeah.
And that's possibly due to controversy about her, or something about her presence just
Yeah.
causes the story to warp,
That
not
actually gives
just,
me chills
yeah.
because from my research and my own pilgrimages and just really diving into her presence, right?
Mhm.
It almost feels like she was Christ's divine feminine consort, if you will. Like she was a Christed, or she was on that path of sanctification and the seven devils and all those things. I don't know how we could go on another rabbit hole with that, but it was like she was so powerful and she was also so human. And
Hmm.
there was it was hard for her contemporaries to know where to place her as a woman. It was
That's
easier with Rabbi and Jesus, right? That's kind
I
of
think,
my take on it.
yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, I think that there is a case to be made that her presence causes discomfort. Certainly, we have sources from the second and third centuries, like the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, and the Pistis Sophia, which all say that Jesus is very close to Mary and that Peter has a problem with her and that the other disciples seem to be jealous of her. And so that is maybe informing us that there's some historical memory, possibly, of controversy around her. And where are those stories coming from? They're independently attested. These are different manuscripts written by different authors in different places.
Yeah.
Why does the Pistis Sophia remember Peter as being so angry toward Mary Magdalene? And the Gospel of Thomas say that, and the Gospel of Mary. These are three different works authored in three different places at three different times. And all of them show some sort of antagonism toward Mary. And so I'm saying that might preserve some sort of historical record of controversy around her, which, if you look at the Gospels, the controversy shows up in a different way. It's in the changing of the story.
Mm-hmm.
So each gospel author changes the story slightly around her to serve their own interests.
Mm.
And I'm saying that's why I would say that Mary Magdalene is more likely to be the anointer in, certainly in John's gospel, but maybe historically. I'm saying that the story warped, the story changed, names
Yeah.
were withheld, details were moved because there was something about her that couldn't be tolerated. And I'm saying that even if you drill down even further, you can even find that instability in the manuscripts themselves, not just from gospel to gospel, but from manuscript to manuscript of each gospel.
As if the author or the originator or the person trying to process the oral tradition, if you will, they were wrestling with what was really
Exactly.
going on. Yeah.
Correct. I think Luke has a big problem with Mary Magdalene for sure. So this thing about the seven devils, you have to ask, is that historical? Or is that because Luke, you say, oh, who did Jesus appear to first on Easter morning? Mary Magdalene. Not in Luke's gospel.
Yeah.
In Luke's gospel, she does not get an appearance of the risen Jesus. And also, Luke had access to Mark's gospel. Almost everybody would agree. And Mark explicitly states that Mary Magdalene is at the cross. Luke withholds that information. There's things about Mary Magdalene that Luke seems to be withholding.
Right.
And so Luke is the only one that says she had seven devils. The ending of Mark is a later composition. It's not by the evangelist Mark. That's another text critical manuscript
I
question.
actually kind of like that made it in there because it's a very esoteric wisdom teaching, that you could dive down another rabbit hole with. What is that?
It could be. We have to be careful though. Is that because we want to
Sure.
appropriate something ancient for our own use?
Sure.
Or that is an interesting line of inquiry, but it's also just as possible that Luke does not like Mary Magdalene.
But he
and
was
he's
literally trying
providing
to
this.
demonize her.
That is one way of looking at it. The things we can't know. Maybe Luke
Yeah.
has a piece of information that the other evangelists didn't want to share because they were embarrassed. Maybe Luke knew something that the others didn't, or maybe Luke is trying to smear her. We
Yeah.
don't know.
Well, I think her relevance today and why this red thread is drawing many of us in different backgrounds, and it is because this title of the Magdalene that was appointed by Christ, which I love your take on that.
Could be. We
Could
can't be
be.
sure.
I'm just saying, like, it's very compelling, and that in our day, the relevancy of a woman being given this beautiful Taurus title, with leadership, if you will, with, and I want to ask one more question about like her status in terms of wealth. And there's so many more questions I could, anyway, just her making, like your research with her making the Christological, what do you call it? The Christological
The
confession.
Christological confession. Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, the one coming into the world.
Yeah. So her not only being the first witness at the tomb, but then also making this Christological confession and having all these appearances in these Gnostic texts that we didn't find out about until the 1940s and 50s.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to ask you one more question, and that is about her wealth, her status or her livelihood. Or I think that's why a lot of people, of Magdala, oh, well, she probably came from a wealthy family in that region, and so she was given this title. That's sort of some things I've heard, and I've struggled with that.
I mean, there are places in the Gospels that say that she provided for Jesus's ministry out of her own substance. It says that in Mark's Gospel when it introduces her in chapter 15 by the cross. And Luke also says that when he introduces her and her seven demons. And so perhaps that is, since it's sort of multiply attested, maybe there is some historical memory of her having some sort of financial independence that could be substantiated by the fact that she's not identified by her husband or her father.
Right.
Which most women are. Like Joanna is the wife of Cusa, who's, some member of, I think, of Herod's court. So she's also like a woman who has status, and Mary Magdalene is introduced alongside her. So maybe she has some sort of wealth or status. I want to really clearly emphasize that nobody ever said that wealth came from being a sex worker until the 6th century.
Let's clear that one up.
That's Pope Gregory the Great. Pope Gregory the Great says that Mary Magdalene is a sex worker in the 6th century. And he's like, surely, like, she perfumed her flesh in forbidden acts, and that's where she got the money. And I mean, come on, like that's again perhaps
Yeah,
part of a smear campaign. Remember, our copy of the Gospel of Mary is a 5th century copy. This gospel was circulating for quite a long time. It is absolutely possible that people were just like, what's the quickest way to get people to stop taking her seriously? And that would be maybe to call
sure.
her a sex worker.
Well,
So
but I love the idea of her kind of being a benefactress of this work and furthering it from a materialist
Jesus's
perspective.
work or sex work?
Yeah, Jesus's work.
Okay, just checking.
Sorry, I
I mean, though
switched
she
gears
has
on
been a
you.
patroness of prostitutes,
No,
and
not
that's
that.
that's important too. I think she kind of absorbs it all,
Yeah,
and
she
gladly
did was
so.
like, that's the polarity that we're looking at here. Here was this beautiful, mysterious, compelling figure who had some degree of power and wealth perhaps, and was able to, be part of this ministry in a certain way that the apostles weren't comfortable with, and, it's very, very intriguing and compelling that they
It
wouldn't know how to
is.
place it then, and we don't know how to place it now, but it's coming into the consciousness, so many people are being drawn into that through the red thread.
I think that's exactly what's going on. And yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we can't know for certain. There's so many things about her that we cannot know. We just
Right.
can't know because every source says something different about her. All we can do is go as close to the information as possible, which for me is 1st and 2nd century texts, and also manuscript changes within those texts. That's sort of my interest. As far as how she had her wealth or independence, I just don't think that can be known.
Mm.
But I think we can argue that she was one of the most prominent women in Jesus's ministry, and perhaps a leader of the women, because she's usually listed first. And I think you can make a decent case that whatever Simon Peter was with the 12 apostles, maybe there was some sort of equivalent with the women that Mary Magdalene would have been the head of,
Yeah,
and that whatever that prominence was suppressed or ignored
yeah.
in the long transmission of history. And that's why it's such an exciting time that we live in, when we can see so many manuscripts at once, when all of these texts have come to light, and we can now understand and think about them for ourselves without being forced to have a certain interpretation that's been forced
Yes,
upon us.
right. Isn't that the beauty of scripture, is being able to,
Mhm.
receive it and take it into your being and see how it's relevant for your own life. I will say there is a lot of resistance in many steeped patriarchal religious
Mhm.
traditions where they just are not interested in those texts at all.
Do you
And that's
mean the Gnostic texts?
yes, and some of the others, even the early, the sources that you're talking about, um, the 1st and 2nd century.
But one of the things I'm excited about with what I found in Papyrus 66 is that most of them are interested in the Gospel of John.
Mm.
And I'm saying that maybe the Gospel of John has something for us still, that it's been waiting to share with
What do you think
us.
that is? If you could summarize your research there on that papyrus, what do you think it is?
Well, it's very, if you love the Gospel of John, you probably know phrases like the light shines in the darkness and the darkness does not comprehend it. Another translation of that would be the light shines in the darkness and the darkness has not mastered it.
Mhm.
I would see this as a sort of darkness coming upon the text itself, and the text, in a very Johannine way, lays down its life for the sheep, right?
Mhm.
The text allows perhaps the death of this character. Also in John chapter 12, Jesus says, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it cannot bear fruit. So to me, this is a story about death and resurrection,
Ooh, love it.
the death and resurrection of the character of Mary Magdalene in the Gospel of John over the course of history, perhaps for our salvation. And that's why I love John's Gospel, and why I love that it might be able to do some of the work that the texts that were excluded from the canon, people can't engage with those, or they ignore those, or they say, oh, those are heretical. But you can't do that to John's Gospel. I'm saying John's Gospel might be operating on a higher plane over space and time, even in the way that the text lowered itself to meet humanity where it was at that time. And now it's rising along with this consciousness of the feminine. They're coming and rising together at the same time. John moves along with the consciousness of the people and meets us where we're at.
Well, anything that teaches the death and rebirth and the feminine, going into the feminine and looking at your shadows and the whole death, rebirth, resurrection cycle to me has been really relevant in my life and the teachings of the red thread that I'm drawn to. So I have loved this. It's so fascinating.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. And I'm so glad to get to know you and your work and to talk to the people who are excited about it as well. And I hope we can continue to stay in touch.
Yes. Where can our listeners find you?
My website is elizabethschrader.com. If you want to hear my Magdalene song, well, I
Yeah.
guess you
Well,
can
I
find
thought,
it on
are you
there.
okay if we put it into this episode?
Of course. Yeah. There's like a music video and everything. And at Twitter at LIBBIESCHRADER, Libby Schrader.
Fantastic. So, yeah. Thank you.
It's so great to finally meet you and get to know you, and let's stay in touch.
For sure.